In 1645, a Royalist army sacked and burned Brodie Castle in northern Scotland. As flames consumed the estate, the fleeing family ignored the gold and weapons. Instead, they risked their lives saving a single piece of 300-year-old parchment. That document was a 1312 letter from King Robert the Bruce, proving their legal land rights. For the Brodies, an army was a temporary deterrent, but a royal contract was permanent armor. If the castle burned, they could rebuild. If they lost their paperwork, they ceased to exist. Pop culture frames Scottish clans through the lens of ancient bloodlines, kilts, and violent turf wars. For landowners on the fertile Murray coast, the real threat was state-sponsored legal erasure, a force no broadsword could stop. Surviving centuries of Scottish history required mastering a lethal game of political roulette, where a well-placed piece of paperwork provided the only reliable protection against the crown. The Brodies learned the value of legal standing in 1562. After Alexander Brodie aligned against Mary, Queen of Scots, the crown stripped him of his titles and seized every acre of his land. In the 16th century, they called this forfeiture. In modern terms, it was a hostile corporate takeover and a total regulatory asset freeze. Alexander was a legal nonentity, vulnerable to any neighbor ambitious enough to claim his vacant property. Alexander worked back-channel networks and leveraged political shifts to successfully petition for the return of his estate. The moment he regained legal title, he built a massive stone tower house. This masonry shell functioned as a bureaucratic vault, designed to protect the charters that proved the family owned the ground they stood on. With their base secure, the family expanded. In 1634, they pooled capital to buy the neighboring Lethen estate, creating a 17th-century offshore shell company. If the senior line faced another state seizure, the Lethen branch operated as a parallel legal entity, shielding their assets. This distributed risk model turned vulnerable acreage into a robust corporate network. When regional civil wars eventually torched their fields, the family's survival relied on these legal redundancies. That resilience was tested by Alexander, Lord Brodie, in the 1640s. As civil war ripped Scotland apart, Alexander executed a series of political pivots that would ruin a modern politician. First, as a radical Presbyterian, he forced the exiled King Charles II to sign a strict religious pact. A few years later, when Oliver Cromwell's republic invaded and crushed the Scottish government, Alexander accepted a job as a judge under the occupying regime. Then, the monarchy returned. King Charles was back on the throne, eager to punish the men who had humiliated him. Alexander narrowly avoided the executioner's block, but the new government hit him with a punitive fine of nearly £5,000 Scots. He treated the debt like a massive antitrust penalty, paying the exorbitant fee to stay out of prison, while aggressively squeezing his tenant farmers for grain to keep the enterprise alive. We can track his management through his private diaries. These aren't tales of battlefield heroism. They are the obsessive records of a stressed executive, filled with financial anxiety, rent tracking, and boundary disputes. The Brodie legacy was built by a calculating CEO who traded ideological purity for territorial preservation. During the Jacobite rebellions of the 18th century, the Brodies made their final, most profitable pivot. While their neighbors marched off to fight for the exiled Stuart kings, the Brodies strictly backed the British government, ensuring their lands were never touched by the subsequent mass forfeitures. In 1727, the British state rewarded this loyalty by appointing Alexander Brodie to the high office of Lord Lion, King of Arms. The Lord Lion holds absolute legal jurisdiction over all Scottish heraldry. In effect, Alexander became the chief trademark and patent officer for Scottish heritage, with the final word on which clan crests and lineages were officially recognized. By the mid-18th century, a family that survived by aggressively purging its own myths was legally responsible for inventing and registering the romanticized folklore of the rest of Scotland. It leaves you wondering about your own family tree. When you look back at an ancient crest or a heroic ancestral story, are you looking at a verified truth, or are you looking at a romantic myth designed by a trademark lawyer to hide a much colder story of survival?